Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here no, it's not Intersections because I'm in Des Moines. It's Crossroads. Man, it's been a week. It's been a couple of weeks, hasn't it? And I'm Connie Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and very glad to have each of you here. Crossroads is a monthly luncheon that we hold, and we talk about a variety of topics across the spectrum of issues. And really, it's about civil dialogue on important issues that impact all of our communities. So thank you for being here and for being part of the conversation, whether you are in the room or online as well. It has been a couple of weeks, hasn't it? And it's been hard, and yet we move forward. But in order to move forward, we have to understand what is happening politically, what happened with the election, both at the federal level and also in Iowa. And so we have our very good friend. Oh, this is doing this again. Okay, our very good friend Rachel Paine Caufield. We had a problem with the microphone on Sunday. Who is professor of political science at Drake University. I'm going to just read her bio because it's impressive, and I want you to know that she comes with credentials. Rachel is a professor and co-chair of the Department of Political Science at Drake University. She serves as the co-executive director of the Olson Institute for Public Democracy, and see, this is what it did on Sunday. Okay, hold please. I'll just talk loudly, and then we'll figure it out from here. So, Rachel is the professor and co-chair of the Department of Political Science at Drake University. She serves as the co-executive director of the Olson Institute for Public Democracy and the director of the Iowa Caucus Project. Rachel received her PhD in political science from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and her BA in political science and mathematics. Really?
Yeah.
Wow. I forgot that part.
It's true.
From Hood College in Frederick, Maryland. Since arriving at Drake in 2001, she spent 10 years as a research fellow at the American Judicature Society and 3 years as the assistant director for public engagement at the Harkin Institute. Prior to coming to Drake, Rachel was a research fellow with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. She's an avid and devotee of the Iowa caucuses, as are many of us, and is passionate about encouraging student participation in the political environment, leading student travel, seminars to the Democratic and Republican national conventions, and 4 presidential inauguration ceremonies, coordinating media events, national debates, and candidate visits on campus, and implementing programs to encourage voter registration and turnout. So if that were not enough, Rachel is also on the board of Justice Not Politics, which I help to be part of that work, and working to ensure fair and impartial courts. So please do help me welcome Rachel Paine Caufield.
Let's see if my mic works. Can people hear me?
Yeah, I think
we're all good. Yay! Thanks for having me, and thank you, Connie. So I am the person who is being charged with making sense of all of this, which feels a little daunting right now. And imagine, if you will, look, I even have a little slide for it. Imagine, if you will, that the election was just 10 days ago. And it feels like we've had a really long journey from there to here, and it feels like there's going to be a very long journey ahead. I'm going to preface everything that I say today with a really big caveat, which is that we still have a lot of information coming in, and it will take potentially weeks, months, years to figure out all of the underlying political dynamics that we saw in this year's election results. And it will take us even longer, perhaps, to fully appreciate the implications of those results. So we have to start, first and foremost, whether we like it or not, with a beautiful New York Times map, which I hope you've all seen. I won't be the first person to say it, I won't be the last person to say it, but it has to be the starting point. Donald Trump won the presidency resoundingly last week. Republicans have claimed control now of the US Senate and the US House across every demographic dividing line that has really characterized our politics for the last 50 years. Trump improved upon his performance in 2020. That includes men, women, urban, rural, Black, white, Hispanic, Latina, college graduates, non-college graduates, you name it. 90% of all counties across the United States, when you compare the results from 2024 to the results of 2020, Donald Trump gained support. Those are all those little red arrows. It really was a remarkable year, and it will prompt a lot of soul searching by Democrats. It already has. And in my judgment, it should. In Iowa, of course, Donald Trump won the state by 13 points. He won 94 of 99 counties. It looks like Republicans will hold on to all 4 U.S. House seats. That's, of course, pending a recount in the 1st Congressional District, where Marionette Miller Meeks is currently ahead by 801 votes. In the state legislature, only 1 incumbent Republican was defeated across the state. That's Senator Brad Zahn. In case I didn't know where everybody's leanings were, now I do. 2 Iowa Senate Democrats, Nate Bolton and Eric Giddens, were defeated by Republican opponents. Republican picked up 3 seats in the Iowa House, increasing their majority to 67 seats, supermajority. And of course, there may be a pending recount in Nate Bolton's race. So certainly there are a lot of ways that we can slice and dice those numbers to tell the story of 2024. And my goal today is to offer some preliminary takeaways, things that we might want to be thinking about at this point. So first and foremost, in the midst of a very twisty, turny year, it's easy to forget that the fundamentals of 2024 always favored the Republican Party. And when we talk about the fundamentals, we're talking about those elements of our political system that are kind of most well recognized as predictors of election results. And that's most notably the economy and the popularity of the incumbent president. Inflation and economic pressures certainly were a factor in this race. There was an unpopular incumbent Democratic president in an increasingly nationalized political system. It was always going to be a really tough year for Democrats. And as they say, this was a change election. And a change election is always bad news for the party that holds the White House. It's also true that the calendar was simply against Democrats. They were defending 19 of 34 Senate seats, 3 of which were in states that Trump won handily in 2020. Beyond the fundamentals, though, let's talk about realignment. I was going to say, we have a political scientist here. Realignment is a lot of fun. And for those of us who are political scientists, I think in some sense we kind of dream of the scenario of living through a party realignment. It's fascinating times. So this is a word that's been bandied about a lot in our current political discourse. And in the political science world, a realignment is a dramatic and durable shift in the coalitions that make up the political parties. Historically, realignments in American politics have followed a very similar script. There is some wedge issue that emerges. It cuts across the existing party coalitions, and it prompts a wholesale reorganization of at least one sizable group of voters in what we call a critical election, one big election cycle where that wedge issue really animates the movement of a sizable group of voters. And the key is that it's not just in one election cycle where a group of voters moves, it's a lasting shift that is sustained in subsequent elections, so it's persistent. Right. Party realignments have happened regularly in American politics, roughly every 30 to 40 years. So as we look back on American politics, we're talking about the election of 1800, the election of 1860, the election of 1896, the election of 1932. And our last realignment seems to have taken place in 1980, It was a little bit different, though. It's what political scientists have termed a soft realignment. And that just means that it didn't happen in one critical election. It happened over a series of elections from 1968 to 1980. And there are a lot of theories about why it was a soft realignment. Right? But what we know is that 1980 seemed to be the culminating election where the movement that had happened over a series of elections persisted. It lasted. The Republican Party, right, had a group of white Southerners that moved into the party, and the party was really reoriented towards social and religious conservatism, states' rights, and economic deregulation. And that means that over the past 44 years, since the 1980 realignment, the Democratic Party has relied upon strong support from the remnants of the New Deal coalition from 1932. That includes labor unions, working class voters, Black and Latino and Asian voters, poor white voters. Its policies have really been characterized by outreach to historically disadvantaged and marginalized populations. But over the past 3 election cycles, the Democratic Party has become more affluent, more highly educated, and whiter. The Republican Party has become less highly educated, less affluent, and more racially diverse. This is by far the most racially diverse Republican coalition that we have seen in a very long time. So again, from the New York Times, you can see here key demographic groups that have traditionally aligned with the Democratic Party in the current party alignment. And you can see that first arrow demonstrates movement from 2012 to 2016. The second little portion of the arrow is movement from 2016 to 2020. And the third portion, the top portion, in this case, the dark red portion, is the movement from 2020 to 2024. So you can see among areas of the country, right? And they do this by county because right now that's the most available data that we have. So is aggregated by county. So you can see among Black majority counties, there was a slight movement towards the Democrats in 2016. There was a farther movement towards the Democrats in 2020, right? We're looking at this right here. And then you see a shift to the right moving in 2024, right up there. So it's true for race. It's true for urban counties. It's true for rural counties. And you'll note here, rural counties have been headed to the right for a long time. But even among those urban counties, there was a sizable shift towards the Republican Party. And of course, the vaunted suburbs, where everybody thinks this fight is really being waged, you see a substantial movement towards the Republican Party in those counties as well, right? In terms of level of education, much has been made of the diploma divide, the divide between college-educated and non-college educated voters. Both areas of the country that exhibit high average education rates and those that have lower education rates both moved towards the Republican Party. In terms of the manufacturing base, right, we have exactly the same story across counties where mining is a predominant industry, where manufacturing is a dominant industry. Those are old labor union towns in particular, and farming counties have been headed to the right for a long time. So I would argue that the long-term effects of globalization and trade in particular seem to have cut across our party coalitions over the past 3 election cycles. I noted that even in 2016, when you had competitive primaries on both sides, you saw a divide within the Democratic Party based on trade and globalization, and you saw a divide within the Republican Party based on trade and globalization. And so I would argue that that issue in particular seems to have cut across the existing party coalitions, and it seems to have driven a systematic shift in the makeup of the parties. What the 2024 election has made clear is that the current policy commitments of the two parties aren't fully meeting the moment for a lot of voters. And that is driving a form of realignment. What we do not know at this point is whether that is unique to Donald Trump, because the one thing that all three elections have in common is the presence of Donald Trump. Now, two big points that I would follow up on there. First is that we know that 8 million fewer voters turned out in 2024 compared to 2020. 8 million voters. It tells us a lot about the degree to which the two parties as they currently exist are not serving to inspire or engage a sizable number of voters. And you'll also note here that I haven't mentioned yet the issue of abortion. Abortion, of course, was front and center in national elections and in the Iowa legislative elections. 11 days ago, it was just 11 days ago. That's all, just 11 days ago. 11 days ago, before the election, it was widely anticipated that abortion was the Democrats' silver bullet. The reasoning was that it would drive turnout, it would motivate women voters in particular, and young voters, and it would provide a clear justification for the election of the nation's first woman president. But none of that came to fruition. And I think there are a few explanations for that. You'll note here that these are exit polls. This is one of the exit polls that was conducted. Only 14% of voters listed abortion as their top issue going into the election on last Tuesday, right? Exit polls continue to note that the economy was the #1 issue. And I do think that to a certain extent, Democrats' focus on abortion crowded out a focus on economic issues. There was a lot of confidence around the issue of abortion, and so a lot of the discussion ended up heading towards abortion rather than addressing real economic concerns of voters. It may also simply be the case that Donald Trump's efforts to reassure voters on the issue of abortion, including his October 1st statement that he would veto any national abortion ban, and including his ongoing statements that he agreed with the Supreme Court decision insofar as abortion was an issue to be left to the states, that actually persuaded a number of voters to lessen their reliance on abortion as a voting issue. And finally, I would say it's entirely possible that the inclusion of a number of state initiatives and constitutional amendments in 10 states may have effectively backfired, in the sense that it allowed voters to separate a vote supporting abortion rights from their presidential vote choice. In other words, they could vote for abortion rights and vote for Donald Trump. That's a heavy sigh. Heavy sigh. Here we go. You can see too from the exit polls the degree to which the change, right, the nature of change was really significant to voters. So you can see here that, right, 30% of all voters said that the most important quality was that they had the ability to lead, and 28 said that they were looking for a candidate that could bring needed change. Both of those groups went decisively towards Donald Trump. So, in light of all of that, I think it's fair to say that Democrats at a national level, at a state level, and at a local level need to take a good long look at organizational capacity and processes. This is not the sexy part, right? This is long-term capacity building work. Parties are designed as mediators. They connect voters to government. And in the current climate, especially in today's campaign finance system, they also serve as nerve centers. They connect a whole network of groups, some of which are loosely affiliated, some of which are closely affiliated with the candidates and the issues. And one of the most interesting, and I think one of the least widely appreciated components of our contemporary party dynamic is the extent to which Republicans have been building capacity across distinct and overrelated groups of voters. Beginning in the 1970s, conservatives invested in building out organizational capacity with the Heritage Foundation. the Federalist Society, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and any number of other organizations. And these created space. They created space for brainstorming, for the development of messaging, for the long-term construction of arguments around law and policy, for procedural innovation. They provided space for raising up new generations of conservative activists. Virtually every figure in the right-wing universe has some connection to those organizations. And those organizations are still there today. Right? But they've also birthed a whole lot of new conservative organizations. And those new conservative groups bring new voices, new ideas, new data, new outreach, new methods. Campaign finance law doesn't allow them to cooperate with a campaign directly on electioneering and advocacy, but a new campaign finance, or a new FEC rule, a new FEC opinion, so the interpretation of a rule, it does permit these groups to share data. And that network of groups that were similarly positioned to advocate within the conservative universe, they do share data. They actively share data, right? And some of those are legacy organizations and kind of establishment party organizations like the Republican National Committee or the Republican National Senatorial Committee, but it's also Moms for Liberty and Tea Party America and the Faith and Freedom Coalition. They all collaborated together on get out the vote activities, independent expenditures, outreach to voters, advertising, social media strategies. Elon Musk apparently proved very, very useful over the summer in particular when he advised campaign groups and affiliated groups to drive early voting turnout among conservative voters, which is being talked about as one of the reasons that Republicans were so successful across so many areas of the country. Much of that campaign work happened behind the scenes, but the fullest and most prominent public evidence of this collaboration, of course, is Project 2025. Project 2025 is a collaborative endeavor of 107 conservative organizations that were all invited to participate in a visioning exercise. That's what it is, right? They have the capacity, they brought those groups together in a room, and they encouraged creative visioning. What is the vision for the future in the best case scenario? I want to just for a moment kind of pause and suggest that if you were to get 107 liberal groups in a room to engage in a similar visioning exercise, you would not come out with a coherent plan. Right? All of this is to say that the MAGA movement, right? The MAGA movement, it is not just an idea that makes Donald Trump happy, right? It is a movement. It has real organizational capacity. It is empowering a wide array of actors across local politics, state politics, and national politics. And that kind of collaborative cooperation and organization building is simply not happening on the Democratic side to the same extent. Not only does the Democratic Party not have an analogous set of organizational actors, but its own party apparatus has been systematically weakened in many ways. On this point, of course, we're Iowans. We can rehash the changes to the nomination process. Right? The DNC spent 2 years in a convoluted process to change the nomination calendar only to acquiesce to Joe Biden's preferences. And what ended up happening, of course, is that the party, despite consistent polling demonstrating that 60 to 70% of its own voters did not want Joe Biden to be the nominee, they purposefully and intentionally set up a system that would guarantee that Joe Biden would be the nominee. They did that under the guise of inclusivity, while systematically excluding the opinions of 60 to 70% of their own party voters. And for those of us in Iowa, of course, we're more familiar than most about the advantages of competitive party nomination contests. It's a place where the party tests ideas. They can bring new candidates into the spotlight. They can take the temperature of activists and funders. They can build support gradually over time, introduce new arguments and messages. All of that is really important party building work. And it reinforces and empowers networks of voters at all levels of the system. It litigates debates about the ideological direction of the party moving forward. None of that happened this year. And that mess of a nomination process was unique to 2024, but the party has systematically disinvested from state party organizations for years. And that's particularly true in places like Iowa, places that have turned more red. That's actually precisely where the Democratic Party needs localized interests, needs to build localized investment in their network, their full network of support. It's how and where the party learns from the ground up what its voters want. The Democratic Party has centralized so much of its operations at this point that it's missing an opportunity to diversify messages and tactics. So I'll just end by saying, I realize we want lots of time for questions, and I'm sure there are many. So over the past 10 days, I've had a lot of people, particularly on the left, ask me what they can and should be doing right now. And I'm sure that it feels cathartic to express anger and frustration, but we have had years of outrage, and outrage isn't working. Pure and simple. So my first suggestion is to invest in building capacity at all levels. It also means demanding that the Democratic Party start taking state and local parties seriously. It means welcoming a wide range of voices and issues and experiences that, quite frankly, have not been taken seriously within the Democratic coalition. I'm a firm believer that we all benefit from a competitive political environment. I think government is better when candidates need to appeal to voters from all parts of the ideological spectrum and where negotiation and compromise are necessary. That's how accountability happens. It doesn't happen when one party dominates government, when they hold a trifecta at the national level, and they hold a trifecta at the state level, and they hold supermajorities in a state legislature. If the Democratic Party is to become competitive long-term, and I think it certainly can in places like Iowa, remember that it was just 8 years ago, right? Well, it wasn't even 8 years ago, 6 years ago, right? When we, 6 years ago, when we elected 3 of 4 U.S. Congress representatives for the U.S. House who were Democrats. Iowa can be a competitive state, but it requires, right, an openness to new ideas. It requires, by defining the party as something more than the anti-Donald Trump party. So I've had a regular saying since 2016, which is that you can't just point at every Trump voter, call them backwards, call them racist, and then wonder why they don't vote for you. Can't do it. You have to talk to them. You have to be willing to put in the time and energy and money into long-term sustainable party building. Right? And to date, that's not what's happening right now. So my own diagnosis and my own proposed cure is building for the next generation, right? I always say Democrats work for the next election to win the next election. Republicans are working to win the next generation. And so I think there has to be a systematic shift in how we conceptualize the work that we're doing to organize our communities. So I'll end there and take some questions. I'm following Connie on this. Connie's in charge.
This microphone is kind of a little janky, so
It's a little sketchy.
It is.
Okay.
And so, as is indicated by the hands in the air, if you'll raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone to you. Please don't talk if you don't have a microphone in your hand, because people can't hear you online. So I'm going to start over here, and then I'm going to come back over here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the building for the future.
Yep.
In the meantime, though, we have to live with the lies and the over and over and the money, which is driving fear in people. And majority of people who voted this time voted their reptilian brains out of fear rather than cognitively thinking about that. So what do you think? And give me feedback.
Yeah, so for those who didn't hear, is my mic on? There we go. For those who didn't hear the question, what do we do in the meantime, right? We know that a lot of people voted out of fear. We know that a lot of people voted on kind of gut reactions. They were activated by kind of a visceral sense of fear and anxiety in their current environment. And so how do we deal with that in the meantime? And so, there will be a lot of elections over the next 4 years, and some of them will be won by Democrats and some of them will be won by Republicans. And we're going to be on a wild ride in terms of policy. My own view, a wild ride in terms of policy, everyone. This is going to be fascinating. Fascinating. I think that, as I said, I don't think outrage is working well. And so I think, first of all, we have to admit that some of the things that come out of our current political environment may not be the worst thing that's ever happened in the world. That government does need some innovation. Government does need some changes. Our systems sometimes need to be updated. We can, I think, as a group, recognize good ideas when they're out there. And I think for a long time, there's been a kind of automatic reflex to push back against anything that has been proposed. I think there's also just a sense in which, so much of the policy, the real tangible policy that affects our everyday lives is happening in our immediate communities. And so while we spend a lot of time worrying about national politics, we spend a lot in talking about national politics and being activated by national politics, so much of the tangible lived experience of policy happens at our local levels. And that's where kind of building capacity can intersect, I think, with making change for the better. So, showing up to city council meetings, talking to elected officials in your immediate surrounding area, not out of anger or fear, but on a very reasonable, here is why, right? Our community, right? We're talking to people, we're activating people in our immediate community and saying, here is a genuine sentiment, not hyperbole, not outrage, but a genuine sentiment. And we'd like to kind of bring this to your attention, and we'd like to be engaged in the process. And I think generally most people in government, and I realize there are a lot of people in the room who may disagree with me on this, but most people who run for office do it genuinely because they want to improve their community. We may disagree on how to improve our community, but seeking common ground and trying to figure out where we can talk to each other and have reasonable conversations to advance our local interests, I think is really important. So to a large extent, I would suggest turning away from the big media channels on social media and getting yourself all hyped up and angry all the time and actually investing in those processes at the state and local level. There are going to be policies that a lot of people in the room don't like, and they're going to happen.
Rachel,
Right.
I'm going to try something new. Turn your microphone off while they're asking a question.
Okay.
And see if that helps.
We're going to see if this helps. I got to get my microphone. It's off.
Hello?
Oh.
Yeah, my question would be, Donald Trump in Iowa here, 2016, called his supporters idiots.
Mm-hmm.
They applauded. They thought that was great. And more recently, he's called them basement dwellers, trailer trash. And he seems to get by with it. That seems to inspire them. Do you have any theories on that? And why can he get by with it and I can't?
Yes, he can get by with it. You can't. That's absolutely true. So I think, first of all, the original diagnosis of Donald Trump and his supporters, yeah, I don't remember the name of the journalist who said it, that his supporters take him seriously but not literally, but his opponents take him literally but not seriously. There is a culture on the right that revels in this kind of free-for-all conversation. It seems authentic. It seems, right, the way you kind of josh around with a friend as you're, having beer. And so I think there are a number of people who kind of contribute to that cultural norm within this universe. But I also think there are a group of people who say, you know what, I know exactly who he is, but he doesn't back down on things. I trust that he will get things done. I trust that he doesn't kowtow to establishment elites. And so even if I don't like him, I'll vote for him. They think that he authentically represents their interests. Now, we can disagree on whether or not that's actually true. But when you don't feel seen or heard by the Democratic Party, then I think it's a lot easier to feel seen and heard by the Republican Party, right? By Donald Trump and his coalition. And I would also just note that the capacity building that's happening on the right is happening at the local level. It's not just at the national level, it's happening at every level. So they have friends and neighbors who can invite them into a community of people. And I think that feels very real to a lot of people on the right.
Despite the way that they attacked the American people with grievance politics by different cohorts, the reporting was by national media, which was malpractice really. They still made it into a traditional horse race type of an appearance. In interviewing people after the caucuses, one even said to me, "He is our David and Goliath." How this is more than just standard political talk, political speak. This is a whole different new era. Liberal,
yes.
That word has been destroyed, and I would contend that the word Democrat has also been destroyed. How do we rebrand ourselves in this environment?
Yeah, so I don't know that I have an answer about rebranding. I think it has to come from the ground up. I think it has to be authentic to the group of people who are in this coalition right now and who are going to be in the coalition going forward. And so that's a long-term project in terms of rebranding and remaking the Democratic Party from the ground up. Party organizations are remarkably resistant to change. I mean, they are resilient, they are embedded, they are remarkably resistant to change. And right, the Democratic Party will go through a soul-searching process. I've actually already heard a couple Democrats who have come out and basically excused away the losses last week. They've said, yeah, but we did better in U.S. Senate races than we did at the presidential level. Our congressional candidates are outperforming our presidential, so we're okay. No, you're clearly not okay. Clearly not. And so, I think I don't know where that change comes from, but it's gonna have to come. And it's gonna have to come by diversifying the range of people who are in the Democratic coalition. And I would also just note, grievance politics is alive and well on the right. I would argue it's alive and well on the left as well. The grievances are different, but the fact that we're all right now being motivated by fear, anger, anxiety, and much of that is a social media atmosphere that actually encourages fear, anger, and anxiety. That's what people engage with. And so that's what gets put out there and elevated in our feeds. I've told more than a few students this week, just turn off social media. Stop that. That's not helping your brain right now. Turn it off, get away. But then you have to figure out how to harness social media, right? You have to figure out how to harness the tools at your disposal to create a robust conversation among those people who want something different. who don't want what we have right now. And that's going to be a long-term process. That doesn't happen before 2026. That doesn't happen before 2028. That's an ongoing process that's going to have to happen. I would also just note, again, we don't know how much of this is unique to Donald Trump, right? One of the things that's really interesting about this particular era in American politics is that both parties, so there's been a systematic series of procedural changes that any political scientist will tell you have weakened parties overall. Parties have less control over the selection of their candidates than they've ever had. They have less control over the support and funding of their candidates than they've ever had. And so it's really easy for political entrepreneurs to slap an R or a D next to their name and run for office. And if they have enough random people who vote in a primary to support them, then all of a sudden they're running, right? And the party's kind of stuck with them. This is right, and it happens on both sides. And they can challenge establishment figures who have actually been very good for the party, but the party doesn't control that anymore. And so kind of figuring out how to reassert some measure of vetting, for lack of a better word, right? Some measure of reasonable expectations. Here's what we want our candidates to be. And if you don't meet those requirements, you're not going to be our candidate. We're going to have someone else run. And so, you know, Donald Trump has really given us this era. I don't know how much, I mean, both parties, I think, have a lot of work to do going forward in terms of both right now are being defined by Donald Trump. And we need to move away from that model. And I don't think either party is well prepared to do it, but I think the Republicans are better prepared to do it. Rachel, sorry. Okay.
How entrenched do you think, it's hard to predict, I know.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the people who did vote for him, knowing full well that he's a felon, that he's a misogynist, that he's a narcissist, all these things. They still voted for him because they thought he could do something. But yet, maybe they have a sense of morality someplace.
They do.
I'm thinking of national policies that I fear the most, or national outcomes. I mean, I see him inviting Putin in. I see him selling stuff, you know, to whoever. I see him destroying the Palestinians. I mean, the worst kinds of things. Not to mention Social Security and Medicare and you know, all that. So how are some of these people, do you think, who did vote for him, even though they knew very well how bad he is, at what point will they get upset? Will they? Will they accept all the crap that he's going to deliver? I'm sorry,
So let me just first start by reassuring you that most of the people who voted for Donald Trump are very fine human beings. Very fine human beings. And if you don't believe that, then that's part of the problem. Right? So I think kind of starting from that point and understanding and entering into conversation, fellowship, learning, bringing a genuine sense of curiosity. This is not a fluke. People know exactly who Donald Trump is, and this is what they chose, which is either, right, you can either read that as a validation of Donald Trump, right, that these are just bad people who have no problem with the bad things that Donald Trump has said or done, or you can read it as these are good people who are giving up on the Democrats, right? And so if the Democrats, right, if the other party, whatever we're going to call them going forward, right, if the other party, I think, enters into that conversation with a spirit of curiosity, a spirit of understanding, a spirit of humility, and says, you know, obviously there are concerns that you have that we are not addressing. Tell us about them. Like, let us understand your world. And kind of let that community building happen organically. And listen, there's a great book.
Sandy?
Right, like how many policies have to be enacted before they get really angry at Donald Trump. And I don't know the answer to that. I think it depends entirely on different communities, right? Like if Donald Trump comes into office and immediately, starts cutting money for rural schools, then I think a number of rural families get really upset about that. If, on the other hand, he comes in and says, what I really want to do is prioritize, 5G, and Robert F. Kennedy has a fit about that, but it might be really good for rural communities, right? And so part of it is just prioritizing issues, and we really don't know yet how that's going to work. The one thing that, of course, Donald Trump has promised to do from day one is this mass deportation. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know how much it costs. We don't know kind of where and how that's going to be executed, if it is. We don't know. There's been no specifics. This is part of the problem of gauging the policy impact of Donald Trump, is that his plans don't really have a lot of details. So you have a really tough time kind of reading into the policy implications of them. So I really don't know that I can answer that question. Yeah.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi. Oh.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
Part of the devastation I felt last Tuesday night was because I had been so elated after the Iowa poll came out.
Yes.
And so your thoughts on what went wrong with the Iowa poll, and how can we have more accurate polling, not just here in Iowa, but across the nation?
So as I started thinking about this the other day, this event, I asked some of my friends, what are your big takeaways? And one person, their big takeaway was that traditional media is dead and that polling is dead. I disagree with both of those, right? One of the weird things that happened during this cycle is, Nate Silver put his finger on this and named it herding. Throughout much of the cycle, the polls were showing us all basically the same thing, that it was a tied race, too close to call, 48-48. There was no possible way to cut through this and figure out who was actually ahead. But just statistically, the nature of polling, right? You should have outliers. You should have good polls that do everything right and nonetheless give you a result that is wildly outside of what other polls are telling you, right? It should happen at one out of every, depending on the statistical threshold that you're using, right? 1 out of every 100 polls, 5 out of every 100 polls, which means about 1 out of every 20, right? We were polling constantly and we weren't seeing any outliers. And that's weird. And it's particularly weird given that we're in a period of time where, every pollster, it's hard to poll right now, really hard. So many people don't have landlines, random digit dialing. People don't pick up their phones anymore. So you already have a certain amount of selection bias and response bias that's built into polling. You have a group of people who are skeptical of media outlets that do the polling, and so they either don't answer or they answer falsely. So it's hard to poll. And one of the things that pollsters have done to figure that out or to try to address it is they've started weighting subgroups. And it's kind of a secret sauce for every pollster, right? After the fact, they say, well, my poll only contains 5% of voters who are under age 30, but actually I think the turnout is going to be greater among that group, so I'm going to weight those a little higher, right? And so there's a lot of decision making now, interpretive decision making, that goes into generating poll results. And the turnout model for 2024 was particularly hard to predict because pollsters are always learning the lesson from the last election, right? And 2020 turnout was weird because of the pandemic. Really weird. So I think a lot of pollsters were struggling with that. And so I think using their weighting mechanisms, it's a lot safer to come out and say, we really have no idea. And that's aligned with every other poll out there. I think Ann Seltzer probably did what she always did and happened to have an outlier poll. And We should have seen probably more of those outlier polls. The fact that we didn't made hers stand out even more, right? And it kind of gave even more hope to Democrats who were feeling a little beleaguered and uncertain. So they were like, oh my gosh, finally, we have a poll that says what we want, right? Like, yay! The very same day that her poll was released, Emerson College put out an Iowa poll that showed Trump up by 10. There were indications even at the time that even if you kind of looked at the overlapping margins of error, which Nate Silver did, and you tried to puzzle through it, it still looked like Trump would likely win. But polling was hard. And so I think this was an outlier poll that inadvertently gave hope to a lot of people. She has suggested as well that it may have actually driven turnout. It may have made Democrats feel too confident, and it may have made Republicans more likely to vote on election day because they thought maybe they didn't have it. So.
I have a question about money in politics and the fire hose of money that's coming through, and the fact that it feels like we're entering into another Gilded Age.
Mm-hmm.
And your thoughts on how it's affecting our elections. It's deeply depressing.
So by some measures, wealth inequality now is greater than it was during the Gilded Age. It's by any measure, it is among the most unequal societies that we've ever had. And in terms of money and politics, there are all sorts of innovations that are happening. All sorts of innovations that are happening. So where to start? Obviously we've known for a long time that changes in the campaign and finance environment have made it easier for affiliated groups to spend and to spend unlimited amounts of money. The key there is that they don't spend in a way that's directly coordinated with the campaigns. Now, if you're a campaign, that can actually not be a great thing, right? Because it means that the campaigns no longer drive the messaging decisions on their side. So, much of the advertising that you saw supporting the election of Donald Trump didn't come from Trump. And Trump doesn't control it, right? It's by these affiliated groups that are putting forward their own messages and may or may not comport with how the campaign, right, the actual campaign organization wants to speak to voters and attract voters. And the same is true on the left. So that's part of the issue, right? Is that those outside groups, they have nothing to lose. They're not going into government. They don't have to compromise with anyone. They don't have to be credible. They don't have to be legitimate. They don't have to get anything done. They can sit on the sidelines and say whatever they'd like in campaign advertisements, and it polarizes the discourse around the election, and it depresses a lot of people, right? And it drives fear and anxiety and resentment and grievance and all the things that we don't like about our politics. And so that's a question in my mind of kind of cleaning up some of the external, some of the regulations regarding external independent expenditures in our campaign system. The other thing that's really driving campaign finance right now is this shift to small dollar donors. So I assume that all of you, like me, were receiving literally hundreds of text messages and emails every day. I'm on every email list for every candidate that has ever come through Iowa, and it is terrifying, right? There was a period of time in the week leading up to the election where literally every 20 seconds I was getting another text message, right? It's just constant. Many of these are outside groups raising money. Some of them are campaigns raising money. But if you are going to try to get somebody to click through a text message or to click through an email message, the only way to do that is fear, anxiety, resentment, grievance, right? Anger. These are the triggering things that motivate people to give 5, 10, 15, 20, $50. And Members of Congress are doing it, some more than others. Elected officials across state government are doing it. It is the fastest, easiest way to bring in a campaign finance haul now. You can bring a nice infusion of cash to your campaign, is to scare a bunch of your voters into giving you $50 on a Tuesday, random Tuesday, right? And there really are very few guardrails around the tactics that are being used for small dollar donors right now. So much so that CNN had a little report. I'm fascinated by small dollar donors at the moment. CNN had a little report indicating that I think it's $2.1 million was given by 6 people. All people who were elderly, all people who were experiencing cognitive decline, one who genuinely believed that Donald Trump was texting him on a regular basis and he needed to help out, one who was suffering from cancer diagnosis and believed that she had nothing to lose, so she just started clicking on every yes. Another who clicked through on one of the text messages that he received and didn't realize that the box was already pre-checked for recurring donations on every one of the times that he had clicked through. He ended up giving over $250,000, having expected to give 25, right? I mean, like, if you look at campaign finance reports today, it is wacky. These tiny little amounts of money that people are giving over and over and over and over and over again. And you know that it's a symptom of something else, right? Which is that they're being motivated by these negative emotions about politics. And it really undermines faith in elected officials. It undermines faith in policy. It undermines faith in our ability to govern ourselves. We've always wanted a campaign finance system where individual donations are the priority over group donations, right? So the special interests don't have outsized ability to sway the outcome. We have it. Individual contributions rule now, but it's not better. It's not better. And so I do think like, there's a lot of room for some new guardrails to be put on that system for sure. Yeah, so.
I know there are a lot of.
There are. Often it will go to the campaign. It goes through Act Blue or Win Red. Typically, they're the broker. So they'll take a small amount of money. So when it shows up on FEC reports, it'll tell you exactly how much actually went to the campaign. But sometimes it also goes to groups that are acting on behalf of the campaign. Usually, I mean, they'll tell you who's asking for the money, but yeah.
I know there are a bunch of other questions, a bunch of hands that went up, and I apologize, but we are at our time. And I appreciate all of the conversation. Some of it is hard to hear. I understand that. But as a political scientist, Rachel's here to break things down and do so in a neutral way. And I appreciate you, and I appreciate your analysis today and all that you do, and help me to thank Rachel in all that.
Thank you, Connie.
This is live streamed. Thank you, everybody who's online. And it stays on our YouTube channel. So if you want to hear it again, I know that might be hard, but I encourage you to do that, to listen again and to listen with open ears of what is possible, because Rachel gave a lot of ideas of how do we shift things that are happening. And I say that in a nonpartisan way because we're a nonpartisan organization. But who's in power matters to us. Who's in power matters on the issues that we care about. Who's in power matters for the people who are impacted by policy. And so I encourage you to listen to it again, listen with open ears, and be part of the work in creating solutions. So thank you so much for being here, and have a great weekend.